Section 2. The Peril of the Hour. When we are for a moment satisfied, or sated, with reading the latest news of the loftiest social circles, or the most exact records of the most responsible courts of justice, we naturally turn to the serial story in the newspaper, called Poisoned by Her Mother, or The Mystery of the Crimson Wedding Ring, in search of something calmer, more quietly convincing, more restful, more domestic, and more like real life. But as we turn over the pages, in passing from the incredible fact to the comparatively credible fiction, we are very likely to encounter a particular phrase on the general subject of social degeneracy. It is one of a number of phrases that seem to be kept in solid blocks in the printing offices of newspapers. Like most of these solid statements, it is of a soothing character. It is like the headline of Hopes of a Settlement, by which we learn that things are unsettled, or that topic of the revival of trade, which it is part of the journalistic trade periodically to revive. The sentence to which I refer is to this effect, that the fears about social degeneracy need not disturb us, because such fears have been expressed in every age, and there are always romantic and retrospective persons, poets and such riff-raff, who look back to imaginary good old times. It is the mark of such statements that they seem to satisfy the mind. In other words, it is the mark of such thoughts that they stop us from thinking. The man who has thus praised progress does not think it necessary to progress any further. The man who has dismissed a complaint as being old does not himself think it necessary to say anything new. He is content to repeat this apology for existing things, and seems unable to offer any more thoughts on the subject. Now, as a matter of fact, there are a number of further thoughts that might be suggested by the subject. Of course, it is quite true that this notion of the decline of a state has been suggested in many periods, by many persons, some of them, unfortunately, poets. Thus, for instance, Byron, notoriously so moody and melodramatic, had somehow or other got it into his head that the Isles of Greece were less glorious in arts and arms in the last days of Turkish rule than in the days of the Battle of Salamis, or the Republic of Plato. So again, Wordsworth, in an equally sentimental fashion, seemed to insinuate that the Republic of Venice was not quite so powerful when Napoleon trod it out like a dying ember as when its commerce and art filled the seas of the world with a conflagration of colour. So many writers in the 18th and 19th centuries have even gone so far as to suggest that modern Spain played a less predominant part than Spain in the days of the discovery of America, or the victory of Lepanto. Some, even more lacking in that optimism which is the soul of commerce, have made an equally perverse comparison between the earlier and the later conditions of the commercial aristocracy of Holland. Some have even maintained that Tyre and Sidon are not quite so fashionable as they used to be, and somebody once said something about the ruins of Carthage. In somewhat simpler language, we may say that all this argument has a very big and obvious hole in it. When a man says people were as pessimistic as you are in societies which were not declining but were even advancing, it is permissible to reply, yes, and people were probably as optimistic as you are in societies which really declined. For, after all, there were societies which really declined. It is true that Horace said that every generation seemed to be worse than the last, and implied that Rome was going to the dogs at the very moment when all the external world was being brought under the eagles. But it is quite likely that the last-forgotten court poet, praising the last-forgotten Augustulus at the stiff court of Byzantium, contradicted all the seditious rumours of social decline, exactly as our newspapers do, by saying that, after all, Horace had said the same thing. And it is also possible that Horace was right, that it was in his time that the turn was taken which led from Horatius on the bridge to Heraclius in the palace, that if Rome was not immediately going to the dogs were coming to Rome, and their distant howling could first be heard in that hour of the uplifted eagles, that there had begun a long advance that was also a long decline, but ended in the Dark Ages. Rome had gone back to the wolf. I say this view is at least tenable, though it does not really represent my own, but it is quite sufficiently reasonable to refuse to be dismissed with the cheap cheerfulness of the current maxim. There can be such a thing as social decline, and the only question is, at any given moment, whether Byzantium had declined, or whether Britain is declining. In other words, we must judge any such case of alleged degeneracy on its own merits. It is no answer to say, what is of course perfectly true, that some people are naturally prone to such pessimism. We are not judging them, but the situation, which they judged or misjudged. We may say that schoolboys have always disliked having to go to school, but there is such a thing as a bad school. We may say that farmers always grumble at the weather, but there is such a thing as a bad harvest. And we have to consider, as a question of the facts of the case, and not of the feelings of the farmer, whether the moral world of modern England is likely to have a bad harvest. Now, the reasons for regarding the present problem of Europe, and especially of England, as most menacing and tragic, are entirely objective reasons and have nothing to do with this alleged mood of melancholy reaction. The present system, whether we call it capitalism or anything else, especially as it exists in industrial countries, has already become a danger and is rapidly becoming a death trap. The evil is evident in the plainest private experience and in the coldest economic science. To take the practical test first, it is not merely alleged by the enemies of the system, but avowed by the defenders of it. In the labour disputes of our time, it is not the employees, but the employers who declare that business is bad. The successful businessman is not pleading success, he is pleading bankruptcy. The case for capitalists is the case against capitalism. What is even more extraordinary is that its exponent has to fall back on the rhetoric of socialism. He merely says that miners or railwaymen must go on working in the interests of the public. It will be noted that the capitalists now never use the argument of private property. They confine themselves entirely to this sort of sentimental version of general social responsibility. It is amusing to read the capitalist press on socialists who sentimentally plead for people who are failures. It is now the chief argument of almost every capitalist in every strike that he is himself on the brink of failure. I have one simple objection to this simple argument in the papers about strikes and the socialist peril. My objection is that their argument leads straight to socialism. In itself, it cannot possibly lead to anything else. If workmen are to go on working because they are servants of the public, there cannot be any deduction except that they ought to be the servants of the public authority. If the government ought to act in the interests of the public, and there is no more to be said, then obviously the government ought to take over the whole business, and there is nothing else to be done. I do not think the matter is so simple as this, but they do. I do not think this argument for socialism is conclusive, but according to the anti-socialists, the argument for socialism is quite conclusive. The public alone is to be considered, and the government can do anything it likes so long as it considers the public. Presumably, it can disregard the liberty of the employees and force them to work, possibly in chains. Presumably, also, it can disregard the property of the employers, and pay the proletariat for them, if necessary, out of their trouser pockets. All these consequences follow from the highly Bolshevist doctrine bawled at us every morning in the capitalist press. That is all they have to say, and if it is the only thing to be said, then the other is the only thing to be done. In the last paragraph, it is noted that if we were left to the logic of the leader writers on the socialist peril, they could only lead us straight to socialism. And as some of us most heartily and vigorously refuse to be led to socialism, we have long adopted the harder alternative called trying to think things out. And we shall certainly land in socialism, or in something worse called socialism, or else in mere chaos and ruin if we make no effort to see the situation as a whole apart from our immediate irritations. Now, the capitalist system, good or bad, right or wrong, rests upon two ideas: that the rich will always be rich enough to hire the poor, and the poor will always be poor enough to want to be hired. But it also presumes that each side is bargaining with the other, and that neither is thinking primarily of the public. The owner of an omnibus does not run it for the good of all mankind, despite the universal fraternity blazoned in the Latin name of the vehicle. He runs it to make a profit for himself, and the poorer man consents to drive it in order to get wages for himself. Similarly, the omnibus conductor is not filled with an abstract altruistic desire for the nice conduct of a crowded omnibus instead of a clouded cane. He does not want to conduct omnibuses because conduct is 3/4 of life. He is bargaining for the biggest wage he can get. Now, the case for capitalism was that through this private bargain the public did really get served, and so, for some time, it did. But the only original case for capitalism collapses entirely if we have to ask either party to go on for the good of the public. If capitalism cannot pay what will tempt men to work, capitalism is on capitalist principles simply bankrupt. If a tea merchant cannot pay clerks, and cannot import tea without clerks, then his business is bust, and there is an end of it. Nobody in the old capitalist conditions said that the clerks were bound to work for less so that a poor old lady might get a cup of tea. So it is really the capitalist press that proves, on capitalist principles, that capitalism has come to an end. If it had not, it would not be necessary for them to make the social and sentimental appeals they do make. It would not be necessary for them to appeal for the intervention of the government, like socialists. It would not have been necessary for them to plead the discomfort of passengers, like sentimentalists or altruists. The truth is that everybody has now abandoned the argument on which the whole of the old capitalism was based. The argument that if men were left to bargain individually, the public would benefit automatically. We have defined a new basis of some kind, and the ordinary conservatives are falling back on the communist basis without knowing it. Now, I respectfully decline to fall back on the communist basis, but I am sure it is perfectly impossible to continue to fall back on the old capitalist basis. Those who try to do so tie themselves in quite impossible knots. The most practical and pressing affairs of the hour exhibit the contradiction day after day. For instance, when some great strike or lockout takes place in a big business like that of the mines, we are always assured that no great savings could be achieved by cutting out private profits, because those private profits are now negligible, and the trade in question is not now greatly enriching the few. Whatever be the value of this particular argument, it obviously entirely destroys the general argument. The general argument for capitalism or individualism is that men will not adventure unless there are considerable prizes in the lottery. It is what is familiar in all socialistic debates as the argument of the incentive of gain. But if there is no gain, there is certainly no incentive. If royalty owners and shareholders only get a little insecure or doubtful profit out of profiteering, it seems as if they might as well fall to the lowly estate of soldiers and servants of society. I have never understood, by the way, why Tory debaters are so very anxious to prove against socialism that state servants must be incompetent and inert. Surely it must be left to others to point out the lethargy of Nelson, or the dull routine of Gordon. But this collapse of industrial individualism, which is not only a collapse but a contradiction, since it has to contradict all its own communist maxims, is not only an accident of our condition, though it is most marked in our country. Anybody who can think in theories, those highly practical things, will see that sooner or later this paralysis in the system is inevitable. Capitalism is a contradiction. It is even a contradiction in terms. It takes a long time to box the compass, and a still longer time to see that it has done so, but the wheel has come full circle now. Capitalism is contradictory as soon as it is complete, because it is dealing with the mass of men in two opposite ways at once. When most men are wage earners, it is more and more difficult for most men to be customers, for the capitalist is always trying to cut down what his servant demands, and in doing so is cutting down what his customer can spend. As soon as his business is in any difficulties, as at present in the coal business, he tries to reduce what he has to spend on wages, and in doing so reduces what others have to spend on coal. He is wanting the same man to be rich and poor at the same time. This contradiction in capitalism does not appear in the earlier stages, because there are still populations not reduced to the common proletarian condition. But as soon as the wealthy as a whole are employing the wage earners as a whole, this contradiction stares them in the face like an ironic doom and judgment. Employer and employee are simplified and solidified to the relation of Robinson Crusoe and Man Friday. Robinson Crusoe may say he has two problems, the supply of cheap labour and the prospect of trade with the natives. But as he is dealing in these two different ways with the same man, he will get into a muddle. Robinson Crusoe may possibly force Friday to work for nothing but his bare keep, the white man possessing all the weapons. As in the Geddes parallel, he may economize with an axe. But he cannot cut down Friday's salary to nothing, and then expect Friday to give him gold and silver and orient pearls in return for rum and rifles. Now, in proportion as capitalism covers the whole earth, links up large populations, and is ruled by centralized systems, the nearer and nearer approaches this resemblance to the lonely figures on the remote island. If the trade with the natives is really going down, so as to necessitate the wages of the natives also going down, we can only say that the case is rather more tragic if the excuse is true than if it is false. We can only say that Crusoe is now indeed alone, and that Friday is unquestionably unlucky. I think it very important that people should understand that there is a principle at work behind the industrial troubles of England in our time, and that whoever be right or wrong in any particular quarrel, it is no particular person or party who is responsible for our commercial experiment being faced with failure. It is a vicious circle into which wage-earning society will finally sink when it begins to lose profits and lower wages. And though some industrial countries are still rich enough to remain ignorant of the strain, it is only because their progress is incomplete. When they reach the goal, they will find the riddle. In our own country, which concerns most of us most, we are already falling into that vicious circle of sinking wages and decreasing demand. And, as I am going to suggest here, in however sketchy a manner, the line of escape from this slowly closing snare, and because I know some of the things that are commonly said about any such suggestion, I have a reason for reminding the reader of all these things at this stage. Safe? Of course it's not safe. It's a beggarly chance to cheat the gallows. Such was the intemperate exclamation of Captain Wicks in the romance of Stevenson, and the same romancer has put a somewhat similar piece of candour into the mouth of Alan Breck Stewart. But mind ye, it's no small thing. Ye maun lie bare and hard, and ye shall sleep with your hand upon your weapons. Aye, man, ye shall tangle many a weary foot, or we get clear. I tell ye this at the start, for it's a life that I ken well. But if ye ask what other chance ye have, I answer, none. And I myself am sometimes tempted to talk in this abrupt manner, after listening to long and thoughtful disquisitions throwing doubt on the detailed perfection of a distributist state as compared with the rich happiness and final repose that crowns the present capitalist and industrial state. People ask us how we should deal with the unskilled labour at the docks, and what we have to offer to replace the radiant popularity of Lord Devonport and the permanent industrial peace of the Port of London. Those who ask us what we shall do with the docks seldom seem to ask themselves what the docks will do with themselves, if our commerce steadily declines like that of so many commercial cities in the past. Other people ask us how we should deal with workmen holding shares in a business that might possibly go bankrupt. It never occurs to them to answer their own question, in a capitalist state in which business after business is going bankrupt. We have got to deal with the smallest and most remote possibilities of our more simple and static society, while they do not deal with the biggest and most blatant facts about their own complex and collapsing one. They are inquisitive about the details of our scheme and wish to arrange beforehand a science of casuistry for all the exceptions, but they dare not look their own systems in the face, where ruin has become the rule. Other people wish to know whether a machine would be permitted to exist in this or that position in our utopia, as an exhibit in a museum, or a toy in the nursery, or a torture implement of the 20th century shown in the Chamber of Horrors. But those who ask us so anxiously how men are to work without machines do not tell us how machines are to work if men do not work them, or how either machines or men are to work if there is no work to do. They are so eager to discover the weak points in our proposal that they have not yet discovered any strong points in their own practice. Strange that our vain and sentimental vision should be so vivid to these realists that they can see its every detail, and that their own reality should be so vague to them that they cannot see it at all, that they cannot see the most obvious and overwhelming fact about it, that it is no longer there. For it is one of the grim and even grisly jokes of the situation that the very complaint they always make of us is specially and particularly true of them. They are always telling us that we think we can bring back the past, or the barbarous simplicity and superstition of the past, apparently under the impression that we want to bring back the 9th century. But they do really think they can bring back the 19th century. They are always telling us that this or that tradition has gone forever, that this or that craft or creed has gone forever, but they dare not face the fact that their own vulgar and huckstering commerce has gone forever. They call us reactionaries if we talk of a revival of faith, or a revival of Catholicism, but they go on calmly plastering their papers with the headline of a revival of trade. What a cry out of the distant past! What a voice from the tomb! They have no reason whatever for believing that there will be a revival of trade, except that their great-grandfathers would have found it impossible to believe in a decline of trade. They have no conceivable ground for supposing that we shall grow richer, except that our ancestors never prepared us for the prospect of growing poorer. Yet it is they who are always blaming us for depending on a sentimental tradition of the wisdom of our ancestors. It is they who are always rejecting social ideals merely because they were the social ideals of some former age. They are always telling us that the mill will never grind again the water that is past, without noticing that their own mills are already idle, in grinding nothing at all, like ruined mills in some watery early Victorian landscape suitable to their watery early Victorian quotation. They are always telling us that we are fighting against the tide of time, as Mrs. Partington with a mop fought against the tide of the sea. And they cannot even see that time itself has made Mrs. Partington as antiquated a figure as Mother Shipton. They are always telling us that in resisting capitalism and commercialism, we are like Canute rebuking the waves, and they do not even know that the England of Cobden is already as dead as the England of Canute. They are always seeking to overwhelm us in the water floods, to sweep us away upon these weary and washy metaphors of tide and time, for all the world as if they could bring back the rivers that have left our cities so far behind, or summon back the 7 seas to their allegiance to the trident, or bridle again, with gold for the few and iron for the many, the roaring river of the Clyde. We may well be tempted to the exclamation of Captain Wicks. We are not choosing between a possible peasantry and a successful commerce. We are choosing between a peasantry that might succeed and a commerce that has already failed. We are not seeking to lure men away from a thriving business to a sort of holiday in Arcadia or the peasant type of utopia. We are trying to make suggestions about starting anew after a bankrupt business has really gone bankrupt. We can see no possible reason for supposing that English trade will regain its 19th century predominance, except mere Victorian sentimentalism and that particular sort of lying which the newspapers call optimism. They taunt us for trying to bring back the conditions of the Middle Ages, as if we were trying to bring back the bows or the body armour of the Middle Ages. Well, helmets have come back, and body armour may come back, and bows and arrows will have to come back a long time before there is any return of that fortunate moment on whose luck they live. It is quite as likely that the long bow will be found through some accident superior to the rifle, as that the battleship will be able any longer to rule the waves without reference to the aeroplane. The commercial system implied the security of our commercial routes, and that implied the superiority of our national navy. Everybody who faces facts knows that aviation has altered the whole theory of that naval security. The whole huge, horrible problem of a big population on a small island dependent on insecure imports is a problem quite as much for capitalists and collectivists as for distributists. We are not choosing between model villages as part of a serene system of town planning. We are making a sortie from a besieged city, sword in hand, a sortie from the ruins of Carthage. Safe? Of course it's not safe, said Captain Wicks. I think it is not unlikely that in any case a simpler social life will return, even if it return by the road of ruin. I think the soul will find simplicity again, if it be in the dark ages. But we are Christians, and concerned with the body as well as the soul. We are Englishmen, and we do not desire, if we can help it, that the English people should be merely the people of the ruins. And we do most earnestly desire a serious consideration of whether the transition cannot be made in the light of reason and tradition, whether we cannot yet do deliberately and well what Nemesis will do wastefully and without pity, whether we cannot build a bridge from these slippery downward slopes to freer and firmer land beyond, without consenting yet that our most noble nation must descend into that valley of humiliation in which nations disappear from history. For this purpose, with great conviction of our principles and with no shame of being open to argument about their application, we have called our companions to council.